Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. It's good to be with you again this week. Welcome to episode 249. Listeners, we're almost to 250. We'll have more about that at the end of the episode. But I'm excited to be with you again today. And I want to start by giving a little bit of an announcement in case you haven't already seen. There is a new media outlet that is launching next week. It launches on August 29th, and it's called Oklahoma Voice. It's an independent, nonpartisan news organization based here in Oklahoma that they say that they elevate the voices and the stories of Oklahomans impacted by decisions in Oklahoma City, at the state capitol, and beyond. They do daily news stories, briefs, commentary, some investigations. Their focus is on essentially on the state capitol, government, politics in Oklahoma, and how it is impacting our daily lives. There will be some familiar names attached to it. If you haven't already seen this, Janelle Strickland, who formerly worked for CHNI. You've probably seen her byline in a lot of newspapers around the state. She is the editor. Carmen Foreman from the Oklahoman and the Tulsa World is now with Oklahoma Voice. Nuria Martinez Keel is there. And then Mindy Reagan Wood is also there. So it's 4 women, which I think is kind of cool. Mindy's beat is going to be infrastructure and programs that serve disabled Oklahomans. Nuria is covering the legislature and public schools. Carmen is covering the legislature, as she has been for the last several years, and also healthcare, federal government, and higher ed. And then, as I said, Janelle will be the editor and she's got, I think, like almost a decade of experience covering the legislature. Super exciting. You can go to oklahomavoice.com and sign up for their first email newsletter. As I said, it'll go out in just a few days on the 29th. I'm really excited to see how this plays out. My understanding is that they are somewhat connected to a national group called the State's Newsroom. And this is the 35th or 36th state-based newsroom that they've launched. It's all kind of nonpartisan, nonprofit with a focus on accountability, on kind of watchdog news. And for my money, you can never have too much of that. Speaking of money, it's free. No paywall, right? This is a nonprofit. If you read Oklahoma Watch, I would imagine it's somewhat similar to that. So this is a great addition, I think, to the Oklahoma local media environment. We've seen huge cuts over the last, 5-10 years to media. We've lost a lot of great reporters. This is, I think, really exciting. I think this is unconnected, but this happened the same week. There's a new sports outlet too, right? And it's called not Sold Out, but something along those lines. Sellout Crowd. That's what it's called. And I think it was a brainchild of a couple of PR people here in town, but like Barry Trammell and some of those folks are over there. I've pulled back from sports reporting years ago. It's just not my jam. But it's cool that there's like 2 new kind of semi-independent news outlets going out. One for political news, one for sports. There's obviously connections there, or analogies at least, but knock yourself out. It should be a great environment for news in Oklahoma moving forward. Now that announcement is out of the way, I do want to introduce our guest today. It's Dr. Emily Stacey from Rose State College. Dr. Stacey, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
May I call you Emily?
Please, of course.
Okay, great. I figured that was okay, but
Absolutely.
For the sake of the appearance of the podcast, yes. Both our listeners will ask me about that. Well, Emily, thank you so much for being here. You are a professor of political science and a program director there at Rose State. Can you tell us a little bit about how long you've been there, what your journey has been like to this point? How did you get into political science, especially the teaching of it?
Sure. Teaching kind of just happened to me. I never thought that I would be in front of people, public speaking all of the time. I did it the first time as an adjunct while I was about a year into my PhD dissertation writing. And
what was that on?
my dissertation focuses on pre and post information age social movements, revolutions, the way that digital technologies are utilized by citizens around the world to create social and political change for themselves. So
like the Arab Spring?
Exactly, my friend. Yeah. So that was one of my studies, the Arab Spring. I did the umbrella movement or revolution in Hong Kong from 2014.
Yeah.
And then I dissected that or juxtaposed it with an American movement, Black Lives Matter. So we did obviously comparative analysis. So comparative theory is kind of my jam.
That's fascinating. Let's come back to that because
Sure,
I want to
course.
talk about the Arab Spring with you, but we'll come back to that.
Absolutely.
So you were doing your PhD,
Yes.
studying this stuff.
Just captive audience. So I fell in love. I had just good luck in getting hired at Rose State as an adjunct. And my first American federal government class, I just absolutely fell in love with being able to talk politics, to speak politics, to these students and really light a fire underneath them, right?
Yeah.
A lot of professors, unfortunately, and teachers just generally speaking, are getting a bad rap for indoctrination and, being woke, et cetera, particularly if you're teaching social studies, government, history.
Right.
It's such an empowering subject, though, or field, and to be in a classroom with folks that are of different ideology. Obviously, I teach in Midwest City, Oklahoma, so we're getting kids from Meeker, Spencer, all over, the state. All of the counties are covered at Rose State. So to come into a classroom and to be met with new faces and kind of fresh meat is what I call them. It's always fun because I'm not there to tell them how to vote. I don't care how they vote. I don't care if they vote communist or Republican or, Tea Party or, super liberal. I care that they vote. And so that is the message that I get out to them on the very first day. The democracy relies on you. It cannot survive without you participating, without your voice. And so that is, I got goosebumps talking about it. It makes me so happy. So American government was certainly not my field. I'm not an Americanist, but I love to teach American federal government because I get to push these kids into understanding their role in their democracy and how they can best advocate for themselves, whatever that looks like.
Right. I mean, I'm sure some of my friends that are more partisan get annoyed with this, but I have long said that my goal, right, is for 100% voter participation. I would love, and this is probably the scientist in me, like I want every single eligible voter to vote for the simple reason that then we would know exactly what people say. The term like this is what voters want gets tossed around a lot, and we don't really know.
And it's a mandate whenever only
55% or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we have you have exactly right. You have turnout that is often less than half of the registered voters, to say nothing about those that are eligible and unregistered.
Exactly.
So you've got this fraction of a fraction that actually turn out, and somehow that is the definition of majority rule. And so whenever, when folks throw around this like mob rule mentality, I was like, listen, that's not the case.
Right.
A good example is, every election, but a very specific election is the election for mayor at any town. We'll say Oklahoma City, right? There are, the population of Oklahoma City is like just shy of 1 million people, I think, right? There's roughly, 700,000 people in Oklahoma County. Roughly half of those are eligible voters. There's kids and folks that aren't eligible, right? So let's say there's 400,000 voters in Oklahoma City, as I'm just kind of estimating.
Right.
Mayor Holt in his last election, there was like 15,000 votes cast, like a tiny fraction. And maybe that's what he received. Maybe that was the total turnout. I forget. But essentially turnout in most mayoral races is like 5 to 10%.
Yeah.
And that's how we're making decisions. So there's a lot of factors for this that I'm sure we'll talk about, right? Everything from, gerrymandering to voter suppression tactics, closed primaries, all these things. There's a lot that goes into it. But the fact is we don't use our voice
at all,
near as much as we could, right? Sometimes at all. And so people say, my vote doesn't matter. I was like, your vote matters way more than you think.
Yeah.
Like proportionally, you have enormous influence.
Exactly.
If only 15,000 people are voting, that's like
Your vote matters.
Right. The governor of Oklahoma, going back to 1970, the average margin of victory, whether it was a Democrat or Republican, is about 142,000 votes, which is not that many out of, 1.2 million that typically get cast. It's a pretty small number, and it interestingly swapped or like flipped, right? So Democrats were in charge for years, including the governorship, and the Democratic governors won by usually about 140,000 votes. And then in a matter of a cycle or two, it just flipped, and now the Republican wins by about that much. And so anyone, whichever side you might be on, you think this is, we'll never win. This is not flippable. It is definitely flippable because there's literally 1 million people who don't vote.
That's exactly it.
And we only need like 10% of them to show up.
If it wasn't flippable, why redistrict congressional districts 3 and 5? I mean, if it,
Why draw the district the way they did? Yeah. So I think I'm stealing your thunder.
No, not at all. Not at all.
This is exactly right. Like people need to know that your vote matters. So if you're feeling depressed or you're seeing all these candidate debates, candidate filings, announcements, it's that time of year.
It is.
Things are gearing up. Right. Just remember that you can use your footprint to make a really big difference.
It's such a big deal, and I tend to speak from the generation that I teach to, and so Gen Z, and obviously I'm a millennial, and so we become the largest, or have become the largest voting bloc, right, in the electorate, but we're not turning out, especially the younger folks, and so that's really the demographic that I'm trying to get to, right? You matter. 18 to 25. You guys need to start turning out. If you do not want to continue to see candidates that do not relate to your issues whatsoever, net neutrality, college tuition, whether or not Social Security is going to be there when these 18-year-olds are 60, 65, et cetera, you need to start using your voice. They're not going to. The parties are not going to listen to you until you start turning out in numbers and you make them listen to you.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to Social Security because so I'm 42 and I've had a conversation in the last few weeks with several friends who are around my age. Yeah. We were all hitting 40 and starting to think, oh man, like I'm getting old. I can't work forever. Like I don't want to work forever. Right. I'd like to retire someday. What does that look like? And when I look at my little, retirement account thing, Social Security is part of that planning, right? For after retirement. So Social Security's fundedness, right? Like its presence in our life is not just an issue for those that are 18 or 20. It needs to be an issue.
It's existential for you and I.
Yeah. I mean, if like my dad, gets Social Security, he's retired. Yeah. Great. He's going to be like, he gets that he's paid into. Yeah. But there's a chance, right, that it might not be there when we retire.
I'm not going to forecast, but I feel like there's probably more than a chance, probably a likelihood. One of the things that I think this generation, Gen Z, needs to start thinking about is, you're working and you're paying into a system, and is it going to be there? Please don't start a revolution today because of what I said. However, it is something to consider. Yeah.
No, I mean, and they've been talking about it for decades, right? Like this isn't new news.
No.
But I think it hits different.
It does.
When you're like, when you're looking at the number you need, like to have income to survive after you quit working. Right. If you're counting on Social Security, you should definitely vote.
Yes.
And you're probably counting on Social Security. For a lot of folks are. That's all they have, right? Like, so whether that's, $20,000 a year or $30,000 a year or whatever it is, that's money that you need to pay rent, to pay your mortgage, buy your medication, pay your co-pays on stuff. Like you got to have money.
Absolutely.
And you can't keep working until you're 90. And so it's those kinds of issues that are probably feel less relevant when you're 20.
Sure.
And just as a check-in for my fellow, Gen X and elder millennials, like, hey, we're halfway there, right? We are. Between 20 and 60 or something, like we're in the middle, and this is a big issue. Mm-hmm. I recently joined the AARP, which you can do at any age. It's really cheap. Yeah. It's like $17 a year if you do it like in a 4-year thing. That's awesome. Get great discounts.
Excellent.
So if you rent cars, if you travel, anything, it's already paid for itself. And I did it because they are obviously like one of the largest advocacy groups in the country. And it helps me, as like, I can't track everything federally. I track a lot of stuff in state. but this is like a simple way for me to pay a little bit of money to get some great discounts on, rental cars and hotels and whatever. I don't yet get free coffee at Denny's. You have to be older for that. But
work towards it.
Right. But this is a way for me to stay in the loop about these issues that are starting to matter more and more.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. So I don't get a referral code or anything. This isn't like one of those podcasts, but use code FIXERS to sign up for AARP.
Yes.
But I think it's worthwhile.
Yeah.
And you get a magazine every month.
That's nice.
I'd like Matt Damon's on the cover. That's a fun thing.
Ooh.
That seems weird to me that he's on the...
Okay. We need to check ages of people.
I think so. I read the other day that 10,000 baby boomers turn 65 every day.
Wow.
So they're a quickly aging population, and it's a huge voter block, as you said, but they are being replaced, right?
Yes.
So a big chunk of them are turning 65, but a smaller number, but still a good number, are also passing on,
over that,
right? Like they're older
and
they're dying. And so like the greatest generation, right? Like the generation that was in World War II and maybe Korea, a lot of them have already died.
Right.
And the next big wave is being baby boomers. And has huge kind of downwind effects for what happens in the electorate. We are facing a presidential election with two elder front runners.
Right.
And I think America is starting to between that and Dianne Feinstein and all of Mitch McConnell, we're starting to have to reckon with what do we do when our leaders are on average decades older than most of the population. Is this good? Is this bad? And how do we respond to it?
Is that representation?
Yeah.
That's the part for me that I think I try to hammer home with my kids. Politics is much less red versus blue these days than it is generational. Right, the issues that we care about tend to kind of shift 50 and under. And of course, I'm not trying to be ageist or anything, obviously. But again, the representation in your Congress is sometimes 3 times older than the students that I'm teaching, and that becomes problematic when you think about them being the ones that are voting.
Yeah, well, and I think for voters, it feels disempowering.
Yes.
It feels like, well, it's just a bunch of old people.
Right.
And what do they know? And we're all narcissistic in our own way and concerned about our own life.
Sure.
But when these things start happening, right? When women lose the ability to make decisions about their own body.
Right.
When the safety nets disappear, right? When inflation goes up or stays persistently high, and rich people get richer and the rest of us can't afford rent.
Right.
What do we do? I think these are things that we don't have to just think about, we are dealing with. And one of the ways we can deal with this is at the ballot box.
Absolutely. Yeah. Of course, NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. And so a lot of the things that you just kind of listed off are things that people don't necessarily think about in their daily lives until it's been taken, until that liberty or that right has been taken away.
Yeah.
And then you see the pitchforks come out, and you see a lot of mobilization, right? You don't get votes, to enshrine constitutional rights to abortion in a place like Kansas without having conservative women who are of the millennial and younger age come out and vote for things like that. So it's incredibly important, and I think it will be specifically the Dobbs decision will be instrumental in the 2024 election. The conversation, the brief conversation, if you watched the GOP debate on Wednesday night, of course, the first question about abortion was directed, or the only really abortion question was directed immediately to Nikki Haley. And it was...
She was the only woman on stage, right?
Right. And so it just became very obvious that these Republicans are entrenched in their opinion, and it may be the one that really costs them in the end,
right?
Because they're not paying attention to that younger demographic of women, college-educated women.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Emily, I think maybe a good use of our time today is to keep doing this, to talk about. I am interested, and I think our listeners are interested too, in what you, as a political science academic, are watching or paying attention to? Maybe you're thinking about some of these things. And so let's start with the debate, if that's okay.
Sure.
You watched it. You had a watch party, which you hosted, right?
I did. I try to, as my role as program coordinator of political science, I am always hosting new events, and my dean and the college are very lovely in letting me kind of do whatever I want. I love Rose State. They're going to have to burn me out of my office now that I have tenure, never leaving. And so debate watch parties were something I just kind of dreamed up in the middle of summer, not realizing that the debate they hadn't set a time for it and didn't start till 8 p.m. So we actually had a really good dialogue with our watch party beforehand, kind of placed bets about who was going to win, who was going to, invoke Trump's name first, etc.
Right.
It was good. It was a good time. My takeaways are, I think, number one, and this is probably generalized across the viewing audience, the person who wasn't in the room is obviously still the front runner. I think the Fox tried really hard to not say his name until they specifically asked the question in the second, I think right after the second break, they asked them about Trump and the indictments and things like that, and if they would support him. And if you saw the footage, it was incredible to watch the wave of hands kind of go up. Nikki Haley shot up first, Vivek shot up right after that, and then it was just kind of this slow wave.
And so I didn't watch the debate. I had something else going on.
Sure.
And so I'm living vicariously through you and, commentators. And in some ways I'm glad, probably for my own mental health, but also
I've heard a lot of that this week.
So what I heard is that all eyes are on DeSantis for this question, right?
Right.
And that he kind of looked around to make sure, am I the only one doing this? And it's wild to me that they would ask a question of hey, all of you who are running against Trump, if he's indicted, will you still support him? And I think Christie was the only one to say no, right?
Well, I think we need to roll back the footage, my friend. That was a little sus. So he says he was waving it off, but that hand looked pretty affirmative. I don't know. We're going to have to roll the footage back on that one.
Right.
He walked it back, certainly, but I don't know.
That's funny.
I don't know, but
that's funny.
It is interesting. So there are some polls out after the debate that don't include Trump, and right now you've got DeSantis, who's leading it by 27%, but it's so narrow between the others, Tim Scott and Pence.
Well, and I expect that on Sunday this week we'll have a bunch of polling data that drops, right?
I would hope so. Ron DeSantis. Man,
my take is that he underperformed.
Very much so. It was hard to watch in some instances. It's obvious that he's gotten some PR notes about being more affable, just kind of looking more human and friendly. And so it kind of resulted in these very kind of weird grins and kind of smirks that didn't quite read as, hey, I'm this friendly guy from Florida. Rather, I don't want to be here and I'm not sure what I'm saying. So it was very kind of indifferent in terms of his performance. But what he had to say was really kind of a nothing burger in terms of policy.
Right.
Once to invade Mexico, I think, was the biggest affirmative policy that he put down.
Oh, yeah. I read some comments that he made about immigrants and some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And just, I think for listeners to be clear, these debates, these early primary debates don't really matter, right? Especially
when you don't have Trump in the room.
Right.
It's hard to take that seriously.
I think I get why he decided not to participate, but I'm trying to imagine what it would be like if he was there. And my main question is, often in a debate, when there is a front runner, everyone else tries to target that person to attack him.
Right.
But this is a weird dynamic, right? Where they were asking him, would you still support him? And he's not here. And so either this is clearly a debate for vice president.
It was not a debate for the vice president.
And, okay, that's helpful. And then, but if Trump was there, would they attack him? Or would they try to placate him? In which case, why have a debate?
Why have a debate? Exactly. There were some very veiled attacks against Trump, but nobody invoked his name until, Fox News asked directly about him. They talked about Mike Pence and, asked the question about whether he did the right thing on January 6th. So that was kind of a bit of a kind of come to Mike Pence moment. Interesting because they kind of begrudgingly, a lot of them, and Christie, Vivek, kind of begrudgingly said that he did the right thing, that Mike Pence did the right thing by standing by the Constitution.
Right.
So that was a bit of a
That's interesting.
letdown moment in terms of democracy.
Emily, do you think that these debates, especially primary debates, are helpful for, I don't know, for voters to understand where candidates reside on policy, or is this more of like a first date personality check?
I think these days voters are already kind of sold on their candidates. They have so much access to the candidates via social media, via all of the sound bites that they're getting on cable TV, et cetera. So I think a lot of people, I mean, obviously the Trump folks, the DeSantis folks seem pretty dyed in the wool, ready to go. So I'm not sure about a first date, but definitely I think they're a place where those undecided, especially when you have that many Republicans running, a place for them to differentiate themselves from the next person. And that really didn't happen except for Vivek, who really was kind of, I've been describing him as if Trump and Andrew Yang had a child. That would be Ramaswamy for me.
Trying to run as an outsider, but
very much so.
And he's kind of a little mini, I mean, he's tall, but he's kind of like a mini Trump, right? Like, and he's trying to, now his introduction has gotten a lot of press, right?
Yes.
Where he said, I'm just a skinny kid with a funny last name. And then when you see that clip following Obama's clip from 2004, where he says almost the exact same thing, I think that couldn't have been on accident.
No, absolutely not. And Christie was the only one in the room who read it. In fact, Christie made that connection and said, oh, well, this guy's trying to be the next Obama, which was met with kind of a little bit of jeering from the crowd.
Sure.
So
I thought about that today. I was like, man, if someone had just like leaned into the mic and said, thanks, Obama, right after he said that, it would have been over for Ramaswamy.
Totally. Yeah, that's what Christie tried to do, but it was too little too late. And I think that, to your point about whether or not Trump was in the room, I think Christie would have performed a whole lot better had Trump been in the room.
That's interesting.
He needed that visceral, right? He needed that poke.
Yeah.
He tried to get a little bit scrappy with Vivek, but we know Chris Christie. Chris Christie is boisterous, right? He's a talker. He was very muted on Wednesday night.
That's
for
interesting.
Me.
And I think for some, it's important for them to be there.
Sure.
And in some cases, the goal is, Ramaswamy had something to earn.
Yes.
A lot of folks had something to lose.
Yeah.
Right. And so
agree.
You're just kind of hoping to stay in it a little bit longer, use it to raise some money, just to assure your base.
Get to Iowa, man.
Right. I mean, there's until votes are being cast, a lot of this stuff is just performance.
It's a sideshow, just a little bit.
Which is a little, I think, exhausting.
It is. It is. I mean, we run 24/7, 365 elections now, campaigns now. You get elected and, if you're a congressional member, you maybe get 6 to 9 months to actually legislate, and then you're running again if you're in the House. You a little bit fair, a little bit better in the Senate. But, Donald Trump got elected and had Donald Trump for, 2020 up in, a couple of months after his inauguration.
Yeah.
And so this is, and that's not just him. This is becoming a professionalized field campaign and elections.
And I think it's interesting right now because of the times in which we live, because Trump is an anomaly.
Yes.
He's a force. He's the cult of personality that surrounds him is a generational thing,
yes,
right?
It is.
And the allegiance, all this stuff is, in some cases, it's so unusual and hard to wrap your mind around, because he's not like the typical like charismatic, very personable leader that we would expect. Obama's a good example. He's like someone who and Bill Clinton before him, there was a magnetism about them. And I think Trump has something, but it's different. But it's unprecedented to have someone have such control over a debate that wasn't even in the room.
Yeah. That's the
much less the fact that he's facing now 4 indictments.
Yes.
So
and just one, right.
Right.
Overall, 91, I think, is total across the 4 states.
Yeah, right.
It was interesting. I think that he the brand in and of itself. That's the mark of an ideologue. So he's just kind of taken the more, totalitarian, kind of the more authoritarian traits of an ideologue and kind of used that to his advantage, right? Kind of the more fear-based manipulation or sharing of ideas versus, even a George W. Bush was charismatic in his own way, choking on a pretzel. How many people recovered from that? And so you're absolutely correct. I don't think he has a need or really a want to be that charismatic.
Yeah.
It doesn't. Why it's not beneficial?
No, and I think we all know that at the end of the day, when it gets to the primary elections next year, right?
Yeah.
So in Oklahoma, it's next March. We're on Super Tuesday, and voters, right? In most states, in Oklahoma for sure, these are closed primaries.
Yes.
So only Republican voters will be able to vote.
Yep.
And so, in states like Oklahoma, all the Democrats, all the independents, all the libertarians, and anybody else are not allowed to vote in that. Mm-hmm. And so we might pay attention to it now.
Right.
But there's nothing it is totally inactionable information, which is part of why I didn't watch. Also, if I was a professor of poli-sci, I would have watched.
All right.
But there's nothing about that really impacts my life today in a way. And I'm sure that's the case for some of our listeners.
Yeah.
But I think we also try not to watch, but keep one eye open on it.
Right.
Because you kind of want to know what's going on over there. Because there's not, at least right now, there's not any debates on the Democratic side.
Can you imagine Joe Biden and Marianne Williamson?
Ooh, I forgot that she's running. Is she running as a Democrat?
Uh-huh.
That's interesting.
She
last time
RFK Jr. and Biden.
Oh, that's
stage.
right.
That would be good popcorn.
Oh man, yeah. See, and this is the kind of thing where I think if you're sitting at home and pointing fingers at the other party from yours, and that they're a mess, what's the old adage? If you're pointing at someone else, there's three fingers pointing back at you.
Exactly.
That kind of thing.
Spider-Man meme.
Right. Yeah. And so I think we have to be mindful of that. And as listeners know, I'm a registered independent, and in many cases, in many states, independents are cut out entirely.
Yeah, unfortunately,
you get no vote in any primary. In Oklahoma, at least, you can vote in Democratic primaries right now, but in some states that's not the case.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you've got a majority of the nation that is now 43% identify as independent.
That's right. It's the largest. We'll say it's not partisan, but the largest block like that. Yeah. Is a big deal.
It means that the parties are having to work harder once they go to the fringes in the primary. They're having to work a whole lot harder to get back to the center to pull those folks from the 43% in the middle.
Yeah.
So that's what makes, a Trump, even though it seems like a foregone conclusion that he's going to be the primary winner for the Republicans, it makes it a hard sell for those 43% in the middle who are not polling well right now for Trump. Right.
And I think you said this on purpose, but I want to say that just because someone is a registered independent doesn't mean that they're necessarily a centrist or a moderate.
No, not at all.
In many cases, they might be as conservative or as progressive as their partisan neighbors.
Absolutely.
But they are, for whatever reason, dissatisfied, frustrated, angry at the two-party duopoly system we have right now, and have decided to say, I don't fit into one of your neat buckets. I'm not following you in that way. And I think, what we see then is these closed primaries lead to that shrinking minority of partisan voters who are making outsized decisions.
Yes.
So, Unite America, national cross-partisan organization, has been doing research on this for years, and they call this the primary problem, right? The primary problem facing democracy is closed primaries.
Yep.
Last year, in 2022, 83% of houses or seats in Congress and the House of Representatives, which were all up for election last year, 83% were decided by only 8% of voters nationally.
Wow.
That is a bigger margin. A larger number of seats and a smaller percentage of voters than it was in 2020.
Yeah.
So this primary problem is getting worse.
Yeah.
But if you can imagine I mean, that's nuts. Only 8% of voters made the decisions for 83% of congressional representation. That means that the other 92% of voters were effectively disenfranchised.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because those are all races that were decided behind closed primaries,
Mm-hmm.
and then they were virtually assured to win.
Yeah.
Because of gerrymandering.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And, incumbent bias and
Advantage,
other factors like that. But it makes for, not just interesting perspective, but it's eye-opening.
Yeah.
When you start realizing maybe these structures need to be changed.
Exactly. Don't get me on my proportional representation multi-party soapbox. It's one for I will bang my fist on your table. I think, and again, this is something that I try to teach my students. This two-party system, it only can continue if you allow it to continue, right? There are third parties out there. Other states have third parties. We now have a right of third party, the Libertarian Party.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible, right? Germany makes it work with 50 parties sometimes running in any given election, right? They have to make coalition governments, which means those different parties have to come together and provide diverse representation, right? That is probably more representative of the constituents, right? And so it becomes problematic for me, I think, in 2023 to continue to talk about just this two-party first past the post, winner take all system.
Right.
I think we're beyond that when you have 43% of folks that do not adhere to, the values and ideologies of the two major parties.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it's hard for a lot of Americans who have grown up in this two-party system to imagine what it would be like. So we think of third parties as being the Libertarians or the Green Party or someone who by the fact that they're there will be smaller. And so we only frame them in terms of spoiler effect.
Exactly.
And what happens in other countries where you have this like multi-party coalition style government, parties are built around not just A or B. Like right now it's like every issue, abortion, public schools, taxes, whatever. It's like, do you want this or this? More or less?
Exactly.
A or B, high or low. And if that shakes out so that you're closer to one or the other, then you get thrown in those camps.
Exactly.
And what we see in other countries is like parties will say, we care about this issue or these three issues, and we're just not even going to take a stance as a party.
Right.
An individual candidate might.
Yes.
But as a party, we're not going to do that. So we're going to talk about labor. We're going to talk about labor laws, workers' rights. We're going to talk about that a lot. And we're not going to talk about abortion.
Exactly.
We're not going to talk about, and some of those other countries, those issues are not even on the table either. So that makes it easier.
Yes.
But here we want to partisanize everything.
Everything. Yeah.
Right? Do you want dogs or cats? If you're a cat, you're a liberal. Get out of here. If you're a dog, you're probably also a liberal. Get out of here. We only like birds. Whatever.
Right.
Turtles. And so I think there's those kinds of things. It's difficult. So nationally, I do some work with the Forward Party, or they're one of our members for the national organization that I run. And this is kind of their approach, right? Like they've caught fire, mostly from partisans, for not taking a stance on things and for saying that's not part of our platform. Yeah. It's up to if a candidate in Oklahoma they're going to reflect their local audience. So these are things that we as Forward Party agree on, and beyond that, it is up to the candidate, and it necessarily should reflect their local environment. So in general terms, like maybe a Forward candidate in Oklahoma is going to be more conservative on social issues than a Forward candidate in Oregon or somewhere, right?
Sure.
But it's really hard for people to understand this. I mean, it's made harder by the fact that Andrew Yang is one part of that, right?
Right.
I mean, Forward Party is much bigger than Yang.
Yes, it is.
But and also just because we expect it to be black or white, A or B.
Exactly.
And for someone else to be like, listen, we've got a few colors. You can pick a shade of blue if you'd like. That's fine. A shade of pink. And so I'll be curious to see. They're not, Andrew Yang is not running for president. They've made very clear that they're not seeking any federal office. I don't know that they're even seeking many state offices, maybe some state legislative offices. But they're like talking about municipal seats and school boards, things that are nonpartisan, to say, listen, we want to move forward And we mean that like beyond some of this two-party bickering. And so people can agree or disagree. I just think it's an interesting approach that is different than what we've typically associated with the other parties.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
So we've talked about federal stuff,
Sure.
some Emily, but a lot of our content here on Let's Pod This is about Oklahoma. What are you watching here? What do you think are the most interesting kind of political and government issues here in the Sooner State?
At the state level, obviously watching Ryan Walters, and the goings on in Tulsa. That is one that kind of hits home. I now have a 4-year-old in pre-K in Norman Public Schools, and so it's something I actually care about now.
And just in case listeners missed it this week, there was 2 very important board meetings, right? One in Tulsa Public Schools where Superintendent Gist resigned.
Right.
I think that was her kind of trying to sacrifice herself for the good of the district, to say, it seems like I'm the identified problem here.
Right.
I'm just going to resign, in hopes that means that Walters and the state board would pull back a little bit on their attack on Tulsa Public Schools. And that was on Tuesday. And then on Thursday, the state board met and was a follow-up meeting to rule or make a decision about their accreditation. And they decided not to take over Tulsa Public Schools yet.
For now. Yes, exactly.
But so they gave them accreditation with
deficiencies,
right? Yeah. So that's kind of the compromise that folks had hoped for.
Right.
And like clearly some things in Tulsa need some work.
Need to fix. Right. No public
Gist
school district in Oklahoma is perfect. I guarantee you.
Right. It is ironic to me that, well, it's not ironic. Here's what's happened, right? Is that decades of underinvestment in public education, and now they're like, well, these schools are failing. And it's like, well, bro, like, we've underfunded them for like 20 years. It makes sense. They might be behind, right? If you don't water your plants, they don't grow.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Anyway, that's my opinion.
Yes.
I took over. Please.
No.
Go back.
We are sort of watching that. So they are okay for now, as you mentioned. We did see perhaps Andy and I have been going back and forth right before the podcast. A website has been teased on social media through some local folks. Ryan Walters. For governor.com. And so we're trying to kind of suss out whether or not that is an actual thing or not.
So I looked up if you go to the ICANN, where you look at like where it's registered. It was just registered on the 22nd. So just a few days ago. And it's just like a GoDaddy website. Yeah. And it says coming in 33 days. I would suspect that this is probably not Walter's camp. It seems like
a little sus.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm curious what'll happen in 33 days. Maybe I'm wrong.
Same. Well, he's got to be thinking bigger. I would expect, him to be mounting some sort of at least campaign in his mind.
Yes, but I would say it is too early.
It is very early.
Right?
Yeah. It is very early. But again, you've got an attorney general who is certainly making himself look real good with all of the parties at this point. Right. And so it might not be a bad thing to perhaps get some good press out there. And, campaigning is a little bit different than actually governing. Ryan Walters is a great campaigner. I think we have seen that, his, videos in his car. He gets very fired up. He can get folks fired up in the kind of same Trumpian way. Yeah. So he's a great campaigner. I'm just not sold on the governance part.
Yeah, I'll be very curious to see what happens. I guess I'll watch that countdown clock.
Yeah.
And that's like middle of September then?
Yes, should be somewhere around the 15th.
Interesting.
And then, of course, we're getting into the lovely bill filing time coming soon. In a few months, we'll start seeing some fun election year legislation come out.
Right,
love an election year.
What do you kind of expect what kinds of legislation would we expect to see next year?
I think you're going to see probably a lot of controversial, obviously, legislation. Whether it goes anywhere or not, it's always good to say, I introduced this bill in Congress or in the legislature. So I expect to see probably some more gun bills, obviously, abortion, what more they can kind of do on abortion and the restrictions there. I think the issue that has been most interesting is the sort of pulling back on referendum and initiative petitions, things like that. Mickey Dolenz has been really, really an effective legislator and speaking on these issues. And so I wonder what next year will look like after seeing Kansas and these other states enshrine abortion rights in the Constitution. What could happen here in Oklahoma? So
yeah, I'm interested. Representative Dolenz is doing an interim study on the initiative petition process this year, and last week I was in Indianapolis for the NCSL Legislative Summit.
So jealous. I love that.
Yeah, so it's the National Conference of State Legislatures. And I'm obviously not a legislator, but there's a lot of nonprofit groups and advocacy groups. I was there with a lot of the democracy reform groups and saw several members of the Oklahoma legislature from both parties who were there, including Representative Dolenz. And some of the sessions talked about the initiative petition process in the roughly 26 states that have it and what it looks like. Some have it only for municipal level, some have it at the state level. They talked about the NCSL presented without taking a side. They just said, like, here are the states and here are the bills that are being filed that would restrict it in some way. And I think they did a good job of presenting, like, there should be some guardrails. I think that's the word they use. There should be some guardrails on this. And the question then is what's a guardrail and what's a restriction? Like, when does a guardrail become too much? It was pretty interesting, some of the conversation. I talked with a legislator from North Dakota where there's only 780,000 people there. And so they have the initiative petition process. And, she's concerned about outside groups coming in and dumping a bunch of money. And she's like, we're low-hanging fruit. It's easy to buy one here. Yeah. And I was like, well, that's interesting because, money flows on both sides of a lot of these issues. If a group an outside group comes in and does spend money on an initiative, on an issue, it's because that issue is contentious, and there was almost always an equal and opposite reaction to that in budget, in some cases even more. And so I think that's a criticism here in Oklahoma as well, that I don't think
the dark money.
Right. And it just cuts both ways.
Absolutely.
And
it always has.
Again, the initiative petition process is used by everybody.
Yes.
It is for the people.
That's right. And so that's why you probably want to restrict it if you want to control what the people are able to do, unfortunately.
Right.
So making it harder is going to restrict the voices that are represented. And so I appreciate the work that Dolenz is doing to try to make people aware of these bills that are out there. Yeah.
Well, I think right now, because of the Dobbs decision and because of votes in Kansas and Ohio, the ballot initiative process is being conflated with the abortion issue.
Sure. Agree. Hard agree.
But it's the ballot initiative is much bigger.
It's so
than
much broader.
One issue.
Yeah.
Right?
It's the voice. It's one tool of direct democracy that we have. And so to restrict that, again, is to constrict your own voice. Yeah. You're on your own feet.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. We'll certainly tune in more about that. I don't remember what date. It's sometime in September, I think, is when Dolenz's study will be.
Yeah, I can't remember.
So we'll certainly pay attention and give an update on that.
Do you want global news?
Yeah, please. Let's end on that.
I'm a comparative man. International relations is what I do. So internationally, of course, I've been watching Ukraine. I love the news that came out earlier this week that verified that Dr. Stacey was correct only months later than that. The Prigozhin news, obviously, I'm not happy that he's dead. However, that dude never left Russia. After the attempted coup on Moscow, of course, Putin allegedly had kind of exiled Prigozhin to Belarus. I just didn't buy it.
It seemed too easy.
Very easy. And then you got those kind of Weekend with Bernie's kind of shadowy pictures and stuff, with him in Central Africa and him in Belarus, allegedly. Right. The comparativist in me who has been to Ukraine and kind of knows a little bit about Soviet politics feels like that guy never left Russia after that coup.
Right. Yeah. No, yeah. I'm just the moment that he stood up and said, we're coming for you.
Yeah.
I was like, either you're going to win or you're going to die.
Yeah.
There's no
No.
let you out. Yeah.
No. And then finally, I'll end here. BRICS, I think this is a huge thing that a lot of folks are kind of unaware of. So BRICS is an international kind of global organization, economic organization, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and now they are expanding. They've already expanded. Places like Mexico, Egypt, etc., have joined. And so this is kind of what we look at internationally as kind of the competitor to the Western kind of capitalist economic domination. And so BRICS expanding, and you also obviously have some pretty powerful leaders there with obviously Putin and Xi Jinping in China. So stay tuned for that. This is not kind of a foregone conclusion. They've been pushing to use another currency effectively with their trade than the dollar. So to really stick it to the United States. Of course, this is not going to topple our economy or anything like that, but it's certainly a development to pay attention to. My latest book that's coming out probably by the end of the year focuses on kind of the force of deglobalization, kind of how we are moving more inward, right? More nationalist policies, things like that. And we're also kind of untethering from international cooperation and alliances. And so it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition, this kind of multipolar, globalized situation, right? Postmodern international community that we've had since after World War II is sort of turning in on itself, right? Like I said, becoming more nationalist. And so as we kind of watch this rebalancing occur, it occurs to me that it's likely going to be a bipolar competition again with kind of the Western world versus China, Russia, and their cohorts. So pay attention to these things.
Yeah, because where those economic lines are drawn is often where political and military lines are drawn as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, for a while we've talked about those as being like emerging markets, right? Where someone that were
they've emerged, my friends.
And
they're here.
And at a time, I mean, this is strategic. I'm sure that the time when the U.S. economy is, a bit weaker than it was 5 years ago, right? And so I think it's something that will almost certainly be an issue in this presidential election.
Yeah,
and
it should be. They better be talking about this. If they're not, then you should be making your candidates speak about this issue. This is pretty important.
Yeah. That's fascinating. You're the first person, Emily, to that I've heard use the term deglobalization. And it was like, I'm sure it's been out there, but I listen to a lot of podcasts and read a lot of news. And so that's the kind of thing that's immediately understandable of like what you mean. Because I think it's the same thing we see on like an individual person level, right? That like 10 years ago when social media was really coming to its own, Twitter was useful. It was a lot of relationships and conversation and things were.
Do you remember people used to flash mob dance in the street?
Yes. How fun.
Right?
How lighthearted.
What happened to this?
We used to have tweet ups. We had a Twestival here in Oklahoma City where we all got together. We'd have lunches once a month with all these Twitter people. And it was really about coming together and building those bridges. And, certainly over the last 5 years, right? 5 years, we have pulled away and have become more isolated physically because of the pandemic, but also socially as social media has gone a different direction. I mean, I use Twitter way less than I used to, and we pull back into smaller and smaller groups.
Right.
And so to see countries doing that seems like common sense. Like, oh yeah, well that's what we're all doing. But it's important to remember that like a lot of the economic growth that has been possible internationally has been because we had free trade. We had open trade. We promoted that intercontinental, international partnerships, ways to grow. There's a recent episode of Freakonomics podcast where he interviews Rahm Emanuel, right? Former mayor of Chicago and chief of staff to Obama. He interviewed Rahm's brother on an earlier episode, Ari, which is both of those are fascinating interviews. They're a whole fascinating family, but the one with Rahm is now the ambassador to Japan. And I for the third or fourth year in a row, the U.S. and Japan are each other's largest like consumer.
Yeah.
Like we buy more from
Yes.
Japan and they buy more from us. And so there's this symbiotic relationship we have there
Yeah.
since World War II.
Absolutely.
And, you know, giving Japan's geographic location and proximity to China,
Yeah.
Russia, India, some of these economic lines that are being drawn, I think will have.
Yeah, they will.
Very-
They're already having.
Very important.
Already.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the supply chain issue that began under COVID, that this is what it is, right? This is the now, the future. This is it. I would not expect anything to change at this point, right? We, Biden didn't come in and sort of undo the trade war-ish, at least the skirmish, let's call it, that Trump started with Xi Jinping. And so nothing was really renegotiated. And so we're still kind of at odds, economically speaking. And certainly the decision to no longer buy microchips, right, to build our own factories, that was a devastating blow to the Chinese economy, or will be in the future. So, this is all happening. The supply chain lines are being redrawn. We are having to do what's called reshoring, where America is having to bring factories that it shipped off back in the 90s back to the United States, because we absolutely are unable to, at this point, to afford to ship some of these things over, or because of the transportation environment, cargo is being stuck on ships, et cetera. All of that has been more or less remedied thanks to, COVID no longer being a pandemic. However, the supply chain as it exists right now is what's going to be in the future as well.
Yeah, well, and this is a good way to kind of connect it back.
Sure.
Wait, I do want to talk about Arab Spring before we go.
Okay.
But on this note, just this week, right, there was the news that a company in Bartlesville is planning to build a factory in Lawton that will, or a refinery for a cobalt nickel refinery in Lawton.
Okay.
And it's being billed as like, a bastion against China, right? And I think it'll be they've said it's the first one of its kind that will be in the United States. And at least on, in the Oklahoman story about it, the top header image is of like 4 fighter jets, right? And so even though this might be an economic issue that has lots of consequences, its proximity to the military installations in Lawton and Wichita Falls. I think this is a big deal, and it's talked about, right, as like a pushback on those supply chain squeezes that are happening coming out of China. And so we'll see if it happens. I think it's a startup. So it's got a long way to go. But they've got some VC money, and we'll find out what happens. But I think it's those kinds of things. If it's happening in Oklahoma, things are escalating.
Yes, indeed.
Well, so we just talked about social media, and maybe we'll wrap up on this note.
Sure.
Because I was talking the other day with someone who is younger. They're in their 20s, and I referenced the Arab Spring, and they had no idea what I was talking about.
Okay.
I'm going to guess.
That hurts me a little.
Well, I was just surprising, right? I was talking about how Twitter used to be different, and I was like, back in the Arab Spring in the late 2000s, and they were like, what? And I was like, you don't, it was like several Arab countries, Egypt, Libya, like all these countries, like essentially had a coup that was orchestrated on social media. Millions of people were in the streets. It was an enormous deal.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they just were in school at a time that was being written into the textbooks and they didn't get it. But it seemed like a consequential moment in history
It was.
that we should be mindful of, and maybe particularly given these economic lines that are being redrawn.
I think that's interesting because I actually watched the Arab Spring, specifically the Egyptian Arab Spring in Tahrir Square from the Oklahoma State Capitol. Al Jazeera was able to set up cameras in Tahrir Square really, really high. And so they broadcast from the square. And so I watched it while session was going on. Yeah. And so I don't know. I don't really find any excuse if I was able to watch it from Oklahoma. You should probably know what the Arab Spring is. Yeah. Technically, it began in Tunisia in 2010, and Tunisia has since been kind of the greatest story to come out of the Arab Spring movement. They were able to really consolidate democracy around Ben Ali, or after Ben Ali's, ousting. And so that has been a real success story. Egypt, unfortunately, has not been. yeah, it's been incredible to kind of watch the waves of movement and revolution occur. So Hosni Mubarak, of course, was ousted in February of 2011 after he cut connectivity off to text messaging, the internet, etc., in Tahrir Square on January 27th, 2011. 2011. My goodness, I sound like an Oklahoman. So he cuts off internet connectivity, thinking that the hundreds of thousands of Egyptians that had already been in the square would just go home. At that point on January 27th, they weren't calling for his ousting.
Right.
In fact, they just wanted reform, democratic reform, specifically involving the military police and the way that they were being repressed and oppressed. But whenever he turned off connectivity on January 27th, it became a full-on, we want you gone, dude. And so he finally was ousted from office on February 11th. But I mean, this was all orchestrated. Wael Ghonim was a blogger and head of marketing for Google in the Middle East and Northern Africa region, and so he was responsible for building the We Are All Qaid Said webpage. And I know a lot of Americans think that we created the We Are All this. It actually originated in Egypt. So Qaid Said was a young street vendor. He was selling whatever on the streets. And so it's very customary for the military police to come around and collect their bribes, right? And so on this day, Said did not give him, or whoever the military policeman was, the bribe. And so they beat him to death on the streets of Alexandria. And of course, this is 2010, where even in places like Egypt, cell phones and smartphones are prevalent. Everybody has at least two. In fact, they're more prevalent. And they come with cameras. And so they record the video. It goes viral around the world. And so this Facebook page is created. And it started as just kind of a wellspring for folks to anonymously talk about the repression and oppression and the violence, et cetera, but became a starting point for a movement. So Ghonim decided that they were going to have a protest, a demonstration on January 25th of 2011. And that's an ironic day to have a protest against the military police in Egypt, because it's actually the day that they celebrate. It's like a holiday for the military police. So Ghonim, with two middle fingers in the air, says, okay, cool, we're going to do this on January 25th. So we're all going to march to the square, Tahrir Square, in the middle of Cairo. So think Times Square. I mean, it's huge.
Right,
it's a huge square. So they all march. And they organize it via Facebook. And so they use Facebook in such a smart way. At certain points, they're posting, maps and routes of how they're going to get to the square, knowing that the military police are surveilling. And so they go a completely different route. Just really, really smart use. And that's why Mubarak, 2 days later, after, hundreds of thousands of folks didn't leave, they camped out, right? So this was a protest camp, which is a whole nother podcast that we can talk about, because I love protest camps. So they built this protest camp, food, hospitals, right? They have an infirmary. They have everything that they need in the middle of the square. So it's really obvious that they're not leaving. And so that's why he cuts off connectivity, which leads to them now calling for his ousting. So it was an incredibly impressive display of collective mobilization. We're talking about a predominantly Arab country. There are some moving photographs where you have men, Arab men, Muslim men, who are surrounding groups of women who are not technically supposed to be out there protesting, but they're being protected. I mean, it was an incredible movement to watch. So Mubarak is ousted. It has turned into, unfortunately, 2013. They oust their first democratically elected president, who was part of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they oust him in 2013, and like we kind of talked about, democracy, it takes a long time, right? You can oust a leader and try to draft a new constitution, but it doesn't just happen overnight, unfortunately. And so in 2013, they got tired of waiting and ousted their democratically elected president. And unfortunately, that's when al-Sisi took over. And so President al-Sisi now has been in power for almost a decade, and he was part of Mubarak's military regime. And so it's basically been consolidated back into a military coup. He's revoked the right to protest, expression, advocacy, all kinds of things in Egypt. I know a lot about Egypt. I used to freelance for a publication out there. So, but it's a really interesting situation, unfortunately, where you have seen, right, social movements have, these life cycles. And one way that they can end is obviously success. One can be just absolute failure, co-option sanctioned by the government. But this is one where, the military, they trusted the military because the military actually protected them from Mubarak in the original Arab Spring in 2011. Mubarak had ordered the military to dispel or disperse of all the protesters in Tahrir Square, and they refused. And so the military turned on Mubarak, and so that's how the movement succeeded in 2011. But it was that same military that now governs them.
Wow.
So
interesting.
Jazz hands.
Yeah, I mean, the outcome in there is maybe not what we had hoped, but I remember watching it as well, and I just remember thinking, it is amazing what people can do when we get organized.
Yeah.
Right.
When you harness the power that you have in front of you.
Right.
Right. So I tease my kids and American federal government, these poor kids. Right. So I tell them the story of the Arab Spring and ask, what's our excuse, right? You're using, the same technologies, the same social media platforms, to, meet your match or, whatever. And other people around the world are using these things to make social and democratic change for themselves. So, you live in a free country with free speech and all of these guarantees. So what's your excuse?
Well, and, in 2018, right, we saw this at the teacher walkout here.
Yes.
Where it was
so exciting.
It was a big deal. In 2016, we had a few events at the Capitol that I didn't intend to have rallies, but they became rallies by the third one. It was about public education then, right? There was budget cuts to public education. And so to have several hundred people in the state Capitol Rotunda chanting, let's fix this, was bananas to me. And then 2 years later, to have 30,000 teachers up there, I mean, everywhere, on every ounce of lawn with a stage, like it was in every stairwell, was a big sign. And, I know it was annoying to some legislators, and that's the point.
Right. That's democracy.
Right. It's not always clean.
Or convenient.
It's
not supposed to be.
Right. It doesn't have to be bloody.
It's
that's
certainly
the idea.
not.
Should not be bloody.
No, absolutely not.
Should not be ugly, all those things. But like, we as people have an enormous amount of agency that is untapped, that we forget about, that we tweet, like,
exactly.
Oh, Ryan Walters, like, is an autocrat. And it's like, okay, yeah, I mean, you tweeted that, or you posted about it, or you highlighted the story.
Right. Are you going to the meeting?
Right.
Yeah.
What else did you do?
Exactly.
Like in those in Egypt, right? People saw the video, and then they got off their ass and did something. Yep. They went there. They stood. Yep. In Oklahoma, like you can organize events. More importantly, you can go knock doors.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can talk to your friends, to your neighbors. You can talk to people that are in your social network. You can talk to your spouse, who you are pretty sure is registered, but maybe you don't know if they vote or not because you just don't talk about it.
Sure.
Your coworkers, you don't have to talk to them about the issues even, but you should encourage everybody to use their voice.
Absolutely.
You will have people. I'm thinking of a guy I know right now who I used to go to for haircuts, and he said he's never voted, and I think about him all the time, and my goal is to get him to vote. And I think we probably disagree politically on lots of stuff, but I want him to know that his vote matters, because it's not just about Joe Biden. It's not just about Donald Trump. It's not just about Ryan Walters.
It's really not about any of those people. It's about you.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Sorry, did I get to your...
No, that's it. That's great. This is exactly right. It is about you. It is about you using your voice, your vote, the way that our system is set up to make a point.
Yep.
Sometimes you lose, but it is still worth doing, right? It takes enormous courage to run for office, even if you lose. If half the state legislature in Oklahoma was elected without an opponent. They filed for office and they won because they did it.
Yep.
And we can be mad that it's a super majority for one party, but the fact is half of them got there because no one else from any party said, hey, what about me?
Yep.
And we don't vote people out. We only vote for somebody else.
Yeah.
So as you see on your social media feed or on the news or in your mailbox, this is the season where people are filing for office. For next November, it's more than a year out.
Yep.
If you're thinking about it, do it. This is your sign. Do it. Even if you are running in a seat that you are very certain you're going to lose, But if that person has been unopposed for 2 or 3 terms, voters deserve the chance to vote for them, right? I had a friend that used to be in legislature, and he went unopposed, and I said, I'd like to vote for you sometime. And he's like, well, I'm unopposed. And I was like, that's not democracy, man.
At all.
I support you, and I hope you win, but I have half a mind to run against you just so that I could come vote for you.
Right.
Like, you deserve to know who actually supports you. Mm-hmm. In a lot of those races, it would be much closer than people think.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be famous. You have to care. Yep. You have to show up, and you have to, whether you run for office or not, we need you to talk to people in your sphere of influence and make this normal. Make them know that voting is the biggest way that we can use our voice, and you can make a change in your community today.
Yes, sir.
So if you want help, reach out. If you want to, we'll come. We'll come. I'll do a presentation. I'll be the one to open the conversation for you. You got to introduce me to your friends. We can do it. Have a barbecue, whatever it is. We can be there. Dr. Stacey, I'm sure would come. She'd love to come talk to a crowd. That's what she does for a living.
Amen.
We'd love to come. If you've got a bunch of like-minded friends and you say, we think we want to do something, we're not sure how to do it, make it happen. Send me an email. podcast@letsfixthis.org is a great way to get a hold of me. It comes right to my inbox. I will respond, and we can make it happen. We would love, love, love to have little pockets of democracy growing all across the country, right? All across the state.
Yes.
I think about a can of soda or sparkling water, all the little bubbles, right? Those bubbles of air that are mixed in with the water are the most important part. That's what makes that water delicious, or that soda. So that could be you. You can be the carbonation our state needs.
I love that.
I'm making this up.
I love that. That was great.
All right, listeners, I will end on that note because, as you know, decisions are made by those who show up. It is time. It is time for you to show up. Have a great week.